Miles, welcome back to Brisbane.
Thank you, Alan.
Yeah, when were you last here?
A year ago, yeah. So I try to come back every year.
Like you were in Brisbane?
In Brisbane for shows with Jan, or if not in Melbourne, or so. Yeah, I maintain a regular presence in Australia if I can.
Okay,
Yeah.
very good. Well, congratulations on the
thank you.
show. Yeah, I want to start with the title actually, because we didn't actually talk about that, so I'm going to learn something.
Okay.
Latent, blatant. What does that come from? What does it mean?
Well, actually, it's Vic Chestnut, who's an American sort of folk country songwriter.
Okay.
And it was one of his songs. I've just loved the title. So I have a little notebook where if I hear something, I thought, well, that might be interesting for a painting or an exhibition. I have a little notebook for titles. Okay. And the idea that with painting, there's a sort of, particularly with these works, there's a blatant in the sense it's very obvious, it's physically present, it's there, you know, it's blatantly obvious. And then the latent refers to sort of the tactile sort of like blocks of this fabric underneath, which sort of have more, I guess, dissimulated marks on them. So it's a more latent something, sort of, you know, in relation to like latent volcano or something that could sort of like,
okay,
there's a latent energy down there. So
that's cool.
Because I think the title should sort of open the work towards new possibilities rather than closing it down. So it's always,
okay,
you know.
Yeah, I don't know the band. What kind of music?
It was Vic Chestnut. So he passed away several years ago, but he's
okay,
sort of an outsider. Yeah.
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 All right. Well, I'll look that up.
Okay.
Yeah. So I've titled the talk. So usually it's the title for the exhibition, and then I give the talk a bit of an exploration title. So I've titled it "What is Experience?" Because I've been thinking about this question for probably a few years, and I'm still not clear on what an answer might look like. So we'll see what we can contribute today. So you and I are both Deleuze enthusiasts.
Yes. Yeah.
And as we know, Deleuze is very hard to read, hard to decode. But let's see if we can elucidate some of his ideas today.
Sure.
But I won't jump straight into Deleuze. I'd be keen to hear, I guess, you know, starting with that question, what is experience? How would you answer that?
Well, I guess it's not fixed. You can't. It's difficult to quantify. You know, there's the experience of. If we're talking about painting, there's the act of actually making the work. But then there's the receptive experience of actually, you know, looking at a work, which is not just looking, but it's also feeling. So you know, like I think experience as an artist, there's not one definition. It's multiple. So it's a difficult question to answer. But I think what we explore as artists, whether it's through music, dance, painting, is being present and engaging, entering into contact with the world through our bodies, through form. And you know, I think as an artist, that's what fascinates me with process, is that I'm working through processes. So I'm very much experiencing the world through movement, through gesture, through time, through space. I'm not sure if that's a good response.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I have no idea, so you know, it's helpful to hear from other people on this. And so what I'm hearing there is there's an experience that you're having while making the work, and then, you know, you're maybe looking or leaving it open for the spectator to have the experience, not necessarily transferred to them, but for them to continue to have an experience with the work until it's finished. I'd be keen to hear of your experience making these works in particular. Like, how did it happen? What, you know, what?
Well, I sort of gone back revisiting previous works from, I guess, 15 years ago, where I was sort of like separating drawing from colour, and I was working on the thin aluminium panels with this. It's basically the same technique with a graphite, oil, and beeswax sort of medium, sort of as an artist, it's curious because you always think you're influenced by, you know, other things, but sometimes it's nice to go back and look at your own work and think about, you know, like it's almost cyclical, you know, like there's things that sort of come back. And after the previous few years' work, my work was becoming quite layered and quite, I guess, it's hard to, but the sort of like obsession with like glazing and quite complicated. And I want to go back to something a bit raw and more just like what is the essence of what I want to do. So for me, it's to do with line and colour.
Okay.
Basically, I've gone back and I had, if you want to talk about the genesis of particularly what's going on down here, I've got a amazing velvet bedspread And like a good boy, I make my bed every morning and I spread it out. And I leave the hand marks of just inscribed on the surface of this rug. And I've been looking at it for years, going, wow, there's something there, I've got to do something. You know, this is great. You know, I can actually draw on my bed.
Yeah.
And then it occurred to me when I was in Paris going through with a friend in a fabric shop, and I came across the velvet, I was like drawing on that, thinking, wow, look at that, it's quite amazing. And then it just like, it occurred to me that, yeah, I'm actually going to use it and try and incorporate it into my painting.
Yeah.
So it's one of those, it's not necessarily deliberate conceptual idea, it comes from just, again, experience, you know, observation. So I'm looking at the world, I'm fascinated by what's around me visually.
Yeah.
And so that was sort of like making a simple gesture, like making a bed in the morning, has sort of like worked its way into this work.
I like it, and we'll talk more a little later because I'm keen to sort of think through the transference now to the spectator. I mean, I've been drawing on your work while I've been here before, but I don't know if that's recommended. We're not going to talk about it.
Well, I don't. It's
It's
I don't say
ambiguous.
yes or no. It's like you have to dare do it.
Yeah. But let's go back. Like I want to trace your biography a little bit. So I understand you obtained your formal art training at Julian Ashton Art School. Can you tell us a bit about what it was like to be there, what you learned, and what you hold dear from that period?
Well, I guess as a 16-year-old, I started doing life drawing classes with David Paulson in Brisbane, who had an amazing life drawing class, and he was a cult figure in that time in the early 90s. And, you know, at 17, I thought, I just wanted to draw, you know. And my father was a lecturer in anatomy at the med school at UQ. And the whole thing about, you know, I loved art history. I loved, you know, the history of art, figuration, but also abstraction. And I had a friend who had just come back from Sydney and had a year there, and he said, oh, yeah, it was great. I mean, because it's like walking back into, I don't know, the 1700s. It's just academic sort of drawing. You can't paint until you master charcoal, you know, drawing the bust. So it's very rigorous. And I liked it because I was young. But at the same time, I realized the limits of figuration, and that ultimately after 2 years there, I knew I didn't want to pass the rest, you know, spend the rest of my life doing portraits. It just bored basically the crap out of me. You know, blending and tonal rendering is like, you know, I got, you know. But at the same time, I was through doing all the figure drawing. I sort of came to terms with the fact that there was an energy in the line and the formal means to make an image that there was incredibly rich. So after hours of like drawing the figure during the day in anatomy, I would come home and just fill the sketchbooks with just sort of abstract drawings without at the time thinking about it was going to make me, you know, that was going to become the basis of what I wanted to do after.
Yeah, sure.
So it's by sort of, strangely enough, a figurative, like, I guess, formation, I learned to sort of like draw on that, but turn it towards a more abstract language.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. It reminds me of that saying, you know, you need to learn the rules before you can break them.
Yeah, yeah.
So you finished there, like.
And then I QCA, Queensland College of Art, where I majored in painting, and then travelled, lived in Europe for 2 years, and then went back to France to do my masters in Montpellier, where I'm teaching now. And by that stage, my work had evolved quite considerably.
Okay.
And by the time I started my masters, I'd already been exhibiting, and the work was definitely pursuing an abstract, you know, idiom.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So at which point on that journey do you make that break from figuration to abstraction?
It just happened relatively. It wasn't a thought. It was just out of curiosity, and I think following your own intuition. You know, in your own sort of, unless it's exciting, why do it, you know, let's face it. So it has to come from a desire. And as I said, the desire to work in a figurative way was just, there was no desire there. So I sort of like, I knew I wanted to be an artist, that was my calling, but it wasn't through figuration. It had to come in another way. So, I mean, art's very difficult, painting is very difficult, but there still has to be a pleasure and I guess, yeah, it has to come from a will to do it, you know, and so it's basically through that.
Okay.
That it's evolved, if that answers your question. But it doesn't come from an intellectual or sort of philosophical.
Yeah, no, and it does. And what I'm sensing is you didn't sit there and go, okay,
No,
I think,
no,
yeah,
no.
it's just
Yeah.
Yeah, you could feel that painting in this way resonated more with you.
Yeah.
You said something to me when we were prepping for this talk, that as a painter, or abstract painter, you attempt to create a field of givens to have an impact on the spectator.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm keen to hear more on that.
Well, that's why I guess like the reading of Deleuze is interesting, because he, like, if we want to talk about that, because he gave me a vocabulary that made me understand what I was doing.
Yep.
So I could sort of name some of the processes without actually it becoming too literary, or, you know, like I'm not trying to illustrate a theory, or like, and Deleuze, he talks about painting, you know, because he wrote a great book on Francis Bacon, Logic of Sensation, and then his book on What is Philosophy, which was a great, like, it just, wow, when I read it, you know.
Yeah.
And basically says there's three ways of entering into contact with the world, or through, I guess, trying to articulate experiences through science, art, and philosophy. He doesn't talk about religion, being very French, you know, post-structuralist, you know, it's another question anyway. Yeah, the idea that we're working with affects as an artist, so which is like it's sensation, so it's retinal, visual, physical sensation, and like art history has been dominated, particularly since the 18th century, through this emphasis on the symbolic, the iconography, the literary reduction of a work to something that can be read. You know, like when I was at art school in the 90s, it was the summit of, you know, postmodern deconstructualism. Yeah. And the idea that you read a painting, but you don't read a painting, like you experience a painting.
Okay.
And strangely enough, Deleuze, even though he was part of that generation, he had another way of thinking about the visual, which I found really liberating, because it was actually wasn't reducing what we were looking at to a series of intellectualized or literary concepts. It was privileging the retinal and this idea of the sensation, of the what he calls the affect, which is like the resonance. And even though he'll talk about Van Gogh, you know, looking at the sunflowers, and of course there's sunflowers, but they're more than that. You know, there's something going on there. The way that the yellow will vibrate. Yes. You know? So it's the great thing about painting is that it's presenting us with an image, but it's a physical experience.
I like this term, right? Field of givens. So if we sort of take Deleuze and his emphasis on affect, and the affective experience of like seeing a painting or listening to music, what do you understand the field of givens to be? Like, because if you're attempting to create a field of givens to impact the spectator, what is? Well,
it's hard to put words to this. That's the paradox. It's hard to put words to what we do, because, you know, we're thinking, working in a visual field, but to name it's difficult. So I guess for me, when I'm approaching, like we're talking about this top part, you know, the relationship with line and things like that, I consider it sort of like a territory. And Deleuze said a great thing about, you know, before we ask who am I, you know, like with the Cartesian notion, it was like, where am I? Okay. You know, which it makes sense. You know, if you arrive somewhere, you don't even have time to think about who am I. You want to situate yourself in space. Yep. So I think as a painter, the idea of working within a space, which is, I guess, a physical space, but it's a pictorial space. It's this idea of, you know, creating a territory about a field and situating myself within this space. Okay. So line is a language. It's a way to construct a dialogue between me and this space. And it's after that, it's very hard to talk about, because it goes into strange.
Yeah. And I think that's what makes it hard. That's why I'm still grappling with experience. What is experience? But I like that answer. Because you're talking about the geography of it, the placing yourself somewhere. Where am I? And so I guess you're doing that while you're painting, but then as the spectator, I can be here and ask that question. Yeah. Where am I? Because in this.
It's the thing when having like my daughter when she was born, I was amazed. It was like really young age. There's something you can make a mark on a piece of paper, and they start making marks. You know, as young people, we want to engage in the world through leaving traces. And I was fascinated by that, and having a kid really just opened my eyes to that. I thought, wow, there is this language that we have, which is sort of beaten out of us through education. But the impulse to draw, I think, is inherent in human nature through all cultures. Yeah. And you'll get it could be something as silly as walking down the beach with like a stick. You know, it's inherent in what we want to do. And leaving a trace, I think, is what fascinates me with what I'm doing. Okay. You know, and if we want to talk about abstraction and figuration, you know, like there's the whole theory that the act of drawing comes from representation. You know, like Pliny the Elder, the Greek, you know, this idea that he said that there was a soldier leaving to battle and his girlfriend sort of drew the shadow of the outline of his shadow on the wall. So the very act of drawing is based on the recording of something which is absent, so to represent something.
Sure.
Whereas I think for me that's not the impulse. It's to just like physically connect with my surroundings.
Yes.
And I've sort of, it's something I think a lot about, you know, is that throughout history, this idea of drawing is always based on a representational desire, a question, you know. But there's not that one stops the other, but there's another impulse to want to make a mark, which has always fascinated me. And so my idea, my role as an artist is how can I make these lines as interesting as possible, you know, on a rather formal sort of basis. As well.
And I like what you said there, you know, coming back to your daughter making marks, you know, from like an infant, from infancy or you know, being a toddler, and being somewhere. And, you know, we see, well, we used to do this, like, you know, tree etchings, so and so it was here, you know, it almost feels like we want to trace ourselves into the space somehow. And that's pre-representational, right? Like you're not drawing a picture of an apple or a chair.
But that's sort of strange enough what I like about this. I mean, this texture, you know, you can actually, people want to come up and touch it. And it's this thing that I'm trying to engage in now is to link like seeing and touching and this strange desire we have to want to, you know, leave a trace. And I like the fact that people want to come up and they can touch the painting, because we all want to touch a painting.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm going off on a sidetrack.
That's great. And we can see that in your own development, right? So you start your training in this kind of highly technical art school. You're representing things, right? You're learning to draw, learning to paint, to represent the figure. And then you make a break, a kind of natural break that came, you know, I guess in terms of how you were feeling. So do you feel that art or painting misses something or loses something when it aims at representation?
No, not at all. I think, I mean, strangely enough, it might seem paradoxical, but my major influences are, it's like they're figurative painters, you know, like I love Italian Renaissance painting, Tiepolo, Fra Angelico, all those artists, they're major inspirations. So it's not, what I'm saying is that I have a problem with figuration at all. I think figuration, I mean, it'd be crazy to say that, because it's just that beyond the figurative, there's like the figural, which is what Deleuze says.
Yes.
It's the fact that you can represent, or you could say rather present something, because this is the interesting thing, because you re-present, if you take the RE off, and you just present something, that's what art does in a way. And we live in a world of objects and forms that are reproduced, particularly now this screen-based culture, like this reproduction, codes, etc. And I think the great thing about art is how we can sort of break through representation to open a space that it becomes something that we don't recognize anymore. And even great figurative work like Van Gogh, for example, okay, there's sunflowers, but then you're forced to look at them differently. Yeah. And this is the thing. So even though I'm talking about abstraction, for me all art is abstract, you know.
Yeah. And so I guess even in a represented or work that represents something, there's something always hiding in there, you know, that can be new, like you talk about the sunflowers.
But even if you look at, I mean, a Rembrandt self-portrait, if you zoom in, there are a series of marks, you know, on a flat surface. Yeah. And that's the beauty of painting, because it's not photographic, it's not digital, it's a physical, encounter. Yeah, sure. And the great thing is when you look at, you know, here we are talking about figuration again, but a Rembrandt painting, it's of the person, but it's also made by his hands. Yes. And I'm looking at it with my body, with my eyes, and there's this beautiful encounter, you know. And at the base, if you zoom in, they're just a series of marks on a flat surface that create this pictorial depth. Yeah. And that's what I'm fascinated by, because the whole history of painting is this reciprocal relationship between something on the surface. Like it's like dirt, you know, being spread about on a flat surface, but it opens up this pictorial space. And that's absolutely fascinating. It's infinite, you know, the possibilities of this language. I just think it's never ending. Yeah. You know, and so that's really what, particularly this work, what I'm trying to do is emphasize the physicality of the surface. And okay, so you get up and look at it and say, yeah, you can see these marks, and there's a sort of like rawness to them, but you step back, and because of the blurred nature and the texture, it opens up a pictorial depth. And I've always been fascinated by that, because there's no other art form I can think of that has this strange relationship between the pure, like, you know, the physicality of the surface, and then this strange space that you can go into, which is a pictorial space you can only find in painting.
Yeah. You touched on the digital just now. I understand your PhD was somewhat related to that.
Yeah.
Specifically rethinking painting in relationship to the digital.
Yeah.
I'd be keen to hear a bit about
Yeah, because I mean, I had the chance to get a scholarship to do the PhD. And that was great because it gave me 3 years to paint. And of course I had to write a thesis.
Yes.
I haven't been able to read an art theory book since, but and as I say, my work survived research, you know. But anyway, that's another thing. But it enabled me to. I'm sorry, I lost the point.
It was the relationship between painting and the digital.
Yeah, okay. So I was thinking about, we live in this world now where we experience images through the screen, and you know, I think it's amazing. Like, so digital technology is fascinating, you know, and we have this now. The image, almost it's no longer an image; it's a performance. It's there for a second, then we swipe it, and something else comes up. So I even say, like, we even call it an image today because it's not, you know. There is no substance, there's no weight, it's just this like transitory, like ephemeral experience. So, you know, if you look at the invention of photography, it forced painters to think about their craft and say, well, you know, we've got this amazing technology, like maybe, you know, we don't need to sort of, you know, record the world, you know, in terms of the figurative tradition like we had to before, because the camera does it. And then, of course, you know, it's Impressionism, Expressionism, and the whole rest. It just opened up, you know, the field, what became modernism.
Yes.
And so now we've got this amazing thing called, like, the internet, digital technology, which is by far now more important than the Gutenberg revolution, and, you know, the way that the effects it's had on perception, our experience, and our relationship with ourselves and the world, and the image is completely changed. I thought, well, what does that mean now to make a painting, you know, in this world? And for me, it's to do with the tactile.
Okay.
Because, and this is really important, because we see, like Paul Klee said, we see with one eye and we touch with the other, you know, and our engagement with the world is inherently visual, but it's also like tactile. And I think painting is one of these rare sort of forms of expression that combine the two.
Yeah, okay.
You know? Because we don't interact in a tactile way with the screen. There is no, there's just no interaction.
Yeah, and I mean, even the swipe, it's on a glass screen.
Yeah,
There's no, you know,
but that's
no
strange
texture.
enough. I've always been fascinated by the greasy marks left on a screen, which is
Yes.
another idea about that.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's great. That's great. And I suppose in these works, you're bringing the tactile to the spectator as well. When
Yeah, and trying to, like, the fact that we see, but we also, you know, like, that was another thing, having a young daughter. When they grow up, you know, you've got to touch everything because you look at it and you want to touch it. So I don't need to touch it anymore because I know glass is smooth, but at some point in my life I have to touch it.
Yes.
So seeing is incredibly, like, haptic. It's very tactile. And I think as a painter, that's the magic of it, you know. Well, for me.
I know, yeah, that's great. So I want to delve into Deleuze a little bit. You talked about the book, Francis Bacon, The Logic of Sensation, and I've got a short passage from there in which Deleuze writes, "The body without organs is flesh and nerve. A wave flows through it and traces levels upon it. A sensation is produced when the wave encounters the forces acting on the body. An affective athleticism, a scream breath. When sensation is linked to the body in this way, it ceases to be representative and becomes real." I mean, you know, a lot of what you've said kind of runs through this, but yeah, what do you think about this passage from
It's hard
Deleuze?
to add to it, that's for sure. Yeah, it's this idea of, like, I guess art is a form of it's an encounter. And going back to what we were talking about before with the physicality, and that we experience the world now through images with no body. There's no, like, weight, there's no substance. And I think that there's this idea that we encounter an artwork with our bodies and our eyes. Whether it doesn't have to be a painting, it could be a piece of music, a dance, a performance, a video. But it creates a sort of like, how do you say, it's a sort of like it's an encounter that makes us think about who we are in space, and it does alter our perception. But it has to come through the body. And I think the body is undervalued in this society, because we can more or less live with just our eyes and a click, you know. And the body is such an important thing, because all knowledge and all experience comes through senses, and it seems to be somewhat dominated by purely the visual. You know, being a painter, I'm very visual, but at the same time, there's this aspect of the body and touch which I think's being marginalised somewhat through popular culture.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, right? Like, if you think about that philosophically, and I don't know how long that debate has been running, but I certainly know that around the time of Descartes and Spinoza in the 1600s, that debate was very much alive. You know, for Descartes, the world is a dual substance. Like, there's the physical and the mental, and I think that idea still runs through popular culture and just everyday thought, you know, and that's where Descartes is sort of, who am I think, therefore I am. But Spinoza, you know, contests that idea. Spinoza's worldview is that there is only one substance, and that's the body. And that thought comes through the body. And it's not this other thing that's out there. And I think you make an interesting point when, you know, you talk about the digital. It's almost like we're collapsing the body into this kind of Cartesian mental space,
which is
where nothing really happens. But
for advertisers and people who want to control us through these screens, you know, it's actually a remarkable device in terms of control. And I think art has to disagree with that. You know, it has to go somewhere. It has to stand up. It has to create it has to sort of create a schism within that somehow, as best as we can, because it has to do with perception as well. Because our perception is now becoming incredibly limited, and I think the role as an artist is actually open perception, perception about what we're looking at. But then, if you can change perception about how the people look at the world, they change perception about themselves as well. And this is what's important, instead of like closing it down, you know. So.
Yeah, but I wonder, you know, what that tension is, because I mean, so Descartes writing about this in the 1600s, you know, Aristotle's writing about this over 2,000 years ago. It seems to be a tension within the human being itself about, you know, who am I?
I'm sort of anti-Cartesian in a way. You know, like there's a lot of, he's responsible for a lot of, you know, bad things. But so yes, trying to unify the, you know, the mind and the body. They work together, and of course, when you're working as an artist, particularly painting is a way of combining the manual with the intellectual, with the emotional. It's all these things that come together. And they're not separated, you know.
That makes sense. No, I'm very much more a Spinozist than a Cartesian. But,
perhaps,
there's another quote from this book, and it touches on, you were talking about the eye. So Deleuze writes, painting is hysteria, or converts hysteria, because it makes presence immediately visible. It invests the eye through color and line, but it does not treat the eye as a fixed organ. It liberates lines and colors from their representative function. So very much engaging with the body, not as a terminus or a point to end, but a point to kind of begin something. So color and line, I mean, we talked about it in preparing for the talk, but what do you understand color and line's purpose in traditional painting, and do you subvert that in some way in your own work?
Well, I guess, you know, it's as any visual person. I mean, there's the basic formal, you know, like line, color, tone, texture that we use to create a composition. So I mean, I'm not necessarily an old-fashioned formalist, because, you know, like it could be a dead-end route, because it has to go beyond both technique and pure formalism. But there's formal, I guess, agency and I guess, relationships that I've always been fascinated in. And like I was talking about Tiepolo before, and when you look at Tiepolo painting, it's not the subject that I'm blown away by, it's the way he's used colour and line. So it's not so much the what, it's the how, you know. And that's why I love when I look at like Renaissance Italian painting, for example. It's the subject. If it was just about the subject, I'd probably get really bored. You know, another Jesus or Madonna, or, you know. But it's just the way they have used these formal elements to create something which vibrates, you know, and it's very close to music in a way.
Okay.
You know, and that in terms of meaning is the other thing, is because like if you look at the Mona Lisa, you know, what does it mean? It doesn't mean anything, you know, but it has an effect on you that then forces you to think and rethink the world and your experience in it. But like it's not a literal, you know, the meaning isn't literal.
Sure. So staying on the topic of color and line, let's talk about the color and line, or colors and lines in these works.
Yeah. Well, these, they're done independently, as you could probably work out. I don't want to go too much into technique and stuff because that can get sort of boring, but it's basically, yeah, working with it's graphite pigment, which of course is a whole link with the history of drawing, which is in, like, I buy in their oil sticks. And so they're not done with brushes, it's just purely like holding the pigment, you know, in my fingers. So it's actually very close and direct.
Okay.
And then I'm sort of using a spatula to sort of like scrape it back. So I'm trying to reduce strangely enough, the surface to like almost make it flirt with something that looks like a printed image. And I like ambiguity, you know, you think, okay, you walk in, you think, wow, that's like painting, but you get up close and you think, well, maybe it's printed. And that's, again, to play with this idea that it's all about surface, but then from a distance it creates a depth. And so they're done on the wall, on the studio wall directly. So that's why you get the sort of like the rubbing effect of like some of the horizontals and verticals are sort of just from the joins of the wooden sort of panels on my studio.
Because you staple them on the wall.
Yeah, they're on the wall, so they work directly. So again, trying to just keep it as direct and as like raw as possible. And then I really wanted to offset that, I guess, the rawness of that with something more sensual and something more, I guess, geometric, playing again with contrast with these like geometric panels on the bottom. So that's the sort of, it's a Sudine, it's called, which is a fake sort of suede, which is polyester. So it is vegan for any of the vegans here. But it's yeah, a certain sensuality with this idea of wanting to touch and to you know, like caress almost a painting, and playing with formal opposites, you know, like that, which has been a large part of what I love with painting, is that it can be very raw, but at the same time quite elegant.
Okay. Yeah, that's great. The technique is fascinating.
Yeah.
And yeah, I can see what you mean about the ambiguity. So,
because the ambiguity is what I love in painting. It's like me in the morning, I'm not the same person as I am in the evening. You know, and the painting's different too. The painting will change. I mean, it's fixed, but depending on the light and the way you look at it as a spectator, it's not always the same. And I think it's one of the great things in all painting is ambiguity. You know, I've lived one painting on my wall for the last 5 years, and it's literally different every day. It's not my painting, it's a friend's, and it's amazing how art has the power to like just resist, you know, in a way. It's there.
That's great. So yeah, I'm still turning over this question, what is experience? I just want to turn to Kant very quickly, only because I feel it might be helpful. So he's a philosopher who contributed a great deal to our modern account of inner experience. So contemporary philosopher Katharina Kraus summarizes Kant's account of inner experience as follows. So 3 dot points. Inner experience is the empirical cognition of oneself as a psychological person. Psychological persons form themselves by realizing their mental capacities, and this part's important, under a unified subject. And then 3rd point, experience is empirical cognition consisting of sensation-based judgments. So, you know, what we see here, like for Kant, is for experience to be possible, Kant is making this claim that we have to at least represent us to ourselves. Right? And then further from that, so he's the first philosopher who kind of moves away from, so we were talking about Descartes and Spinoza before, they're still very much trying to grapple with this notion of what is substance or ultimate substance, what is everything grounded upon. And, you know, Descartes, as we said, grounds everything into the either physical or the mental, and Spinoza says, no, it's all one, and it's all, you know, the body. But Kant moves away from that, and he says, okay, well, instead of trying to think about substance, let me try to articulate what is having the experience of the world. And it's this unified self. And so Deleuze adopts the first idea, which is that sense plays a part in it. But he rejects the second idea, which is that there's a unified subjectivity. And it's because he wants to leave room for what I term discordant faculties, schizophrenic impulse, cognitive dissonance, and make that an acceptable part of being human.
Yeah.
So Kant versus Deleuze, Kant is like, no, everything is ordered, and we're all ordered in our own selves and in our own mind.
Yeah.
And Deleuze says, nah, we've got all of these things that are happening all of the time, and sometimes these things inside us are at odds with each other, and we just have to grapple with that.
Well, I've got, just in terms of this idea of subjectivity, I find interesting because, and this, I mean, you're the philosopher, so you know more about Spinoza and Kant than I do, but there's this idea that, which is Aristotelian, from Aristotle, that matter is inert, that we project our idea upon it. You know, like there's a block of marble, and sort of like, you know, that's problematic because the block of marble has its own sort of set of potentiality, like a piece of wood. Like if you're a carpenter, a tree has, you know, you work with the inherent properties of the materials. So it's not just inert, you know. And I think this idea of the subjectivity or the subjective, as an artist, like when you're working with graphite, it has its own, it wants to do its own thing. And it's not the same as if I was going to use a cobalt blue. So materials in their own right have their own sort of, you could probably say, subjectivities, their own characteristics. And that's something I've been fascinated with through like pigments and stuff like that, is that, you know, like it's not inert matter. It's like, you have a dialogue with this stuff. And it's hard for a lot of people who aren't painters, but you have a dialogue. Like I have a dialogue. When I'm in the studio, I'm not by myself. Like I'm having a conversation. And it's through the support, but it's also through the materials I'm working with. And it's actually, it is a conversation. So I don't feel like it's just me by myself expressing something, because what we're looking at is a result of a dialogue I've had through this thing with material. And I think that this is undervalued in the, well, it's becoming, you know, more and more present now that, you know, our relationship with the world and the environment. You know, a tree is a living creature, you know, like, you know, there's rocks, these things have energies, you know, they're, it's not inert, you know.
And I mean, I love that idea, right? And so you bring out, like by putting this forward, the tension between yourself and the materials that you're working with. I think Deleuze is pushing that even further to say the tensions within ourselves. You know, you might want to make this line, but
our subjectivities aren't unified.
That's right.
At all.
That's right.
We're many people in one. Well, at least you know, I feel that.
I feel that. But so then, if we take that seriously, you know, how would you? Well, how do you, I guess, attempt to utilize that when you're working, and also how would you encourage the spectator to be their multiple selves while engaging?
Well, that's beyond me, really. I guess that would be too authoritarian to tell the spectator how to, you know. And that's the nice thing about a painting. If you don't like it, you just keep walking. It's not like a video where you have to sit there and watch it for 5 minutes, you know. So yeah, you want to evoke a curiosity. If you can, but I think art is like religion in the sense that you have to believe in it, you know, in the sense that there's people who believe in painting. And if you don't, you know, you're not receptive to it. So, you know, it's like, I always had a friend who said, you know, there might be 1 in 20 people who get what you do, but that's great, you know, at least there's 1 in 20. So you can't aim to please everybody, you know, so you just do what you have to do, and you have your own personal, I guess, you know, demands, and you sort of, I can't think of the spectator when I work, you know. So it's, sorry, maybe the question's changing a bit, but it's so I just hope like whoever engages with the work, they do so because they're curious, you know. And that for me is the most important thing, is to sort of like get someone a little bit like, you know, what's going on here,
a little bit intrigued,
which again is why you don't want to just represent or fall into, I guess, codes of things that are too easily recognizable. Because when we recognize something, we tend to just, you know, it confirms our sense of like stability in the world.
Yeah.
And doesn't force us to think because, yeah, we recognize it. And I think whether it's figurative, abstract, doesn't matter, but the great figurative art as well, there's something in it that we don't quite understand. You know, and that's important, I think, in relation to the spectator.
It makes sense, and it makes sense that you wouldn't be, you know, thinking of the spectator while working. So let's bring it back to yourself and, you know, or your multiple selves.
Yeah.
How do you all interact when you work?
Depends which one I ask.
I'm asking all of you.
Okay. I actually try like not to think really. When I'm in the studio, I have podcasts on, or there's a part of my brain that needs to be occupied.
Okay.
To leave the rest
Free to.
Yeah, to do what it does, you know. But I don't have a protocol. I don't have a particular recipe. I don't have a, you know. Sometimes I like just getting up in the morning and just straight into it without even thinking about what I want to do. Sometimes it can take hours to sort of get up the courage to do it. There's no one, and I don't have a discipline. Like I'm not like 9 to 5.
Sure.
Just when it happens, it happens.
Okay.
Yeah. But you know, again, it's like sometimes I know if I've got a show coming up, you know, I have to be working. So you can't wait for inspiration. You've just got to be doing it. And then there's good days and there's bad days, you know. And often when it doesn't work, that's when it's also interesting, because then the next day you go into the studio and you think, well, what can I do now to try and fix it?
What doesn't work feel like? Or
it's one of those things when I think I can walk away and it's not bothering me anymore, like visually. Like I'm a bit sort of manic like that, you know, like even the way things are arranged, I'm just, things can annoy me visually in my perceptive field.
Okay.
So that shouldn't be like, you know, and it's like a painting, I just like, no, it's not. So something there is not right, but I can't name it. I can't use a word to.
Yeah.
It's a visual. You know, well, it's a visual intelligence. I think as a painter, that's what you want.
And you just keep working it until it comes to become rest.
Some sort of resolution, yeah. Whilst maintaining some sort of tension as well.
Yeah.
You know. Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah.
All right. Well, look, I'll wrap up here, but I think other people might have.
Do that one quick.
Yeah. Questions or comments.
I'm very interested in this idea of touching and seeing.
Yeah.
An explanation that I got a lot of understanding from was actually a completely scientific explanation, which actually shows that the eye is actually skin that has evolved into the kind of abilities that we have through light. So the skin itself is primary and the eye is actually secondary in terms of its evolution.
Yeah.
So there is no difference between seeing and feeling. And especially because the optic nerve goes directly to the amygdala in the brain, which is an emotional response to what we see.
Yeah. Well, that's sort of interesting because I wasn't here for the talk, but Aaron, who had the show before me, is interested in octopus, was talking about a similar thing. The tentacles are actually, it's a form of like it's almost visual, you know, the way they can touch and engage.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's like touching or seeing is like touching light.
Yes. Yeah, because in terms of evolution, a single-celled organism that came to be under the sea responded to light and began to move towards the light. And supposedly that's the whole process by which we've come to be.
That's great.
Yeah.
So I don't see a difference between seeing and feeling.
Yeah. But I think that's what I was trying to say before, is emphasize the fact that we do see and touch. It's inherent to our, and we navigate the world. I mean, they're the dominant senses, really, sight and touch, you know. I mean, we've got 5, but they're, for me at least, the 2 dominant, you know. I'd be lost without touch and sight. It would be very difficult.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Is there any significance of the colours at the bottom?
Well, I've sort of had a bit of a fascination. You could almost call it a fetish for like the colour scheme of Piero della Francesco, you know, the Italian sort of like painter. And sort of that's what I was looking at, because there's a sort of harmony between the palette that I've chosen, but also limited by what I could find in terms of the fabric. Because I had to find the fabric. It was in Paris, and I ended up like spending days on sort of like research trips to all the shops trying to find the right range of colours. So it's basically, yeah, it was you know, they're relatively soft, you know, they're not sort of like jarish fluorescent colours. Yeah, yeah. And colours are a fascinating thing because it's very, I mean, it's quite subjective, again, what we're talking about. It's evocative, you know, the idea that this is a sort of like a grey which can sort of, it could evoke sort of, depending on the light, you know, something like it could be a reference to something visual, like a river, or, you know, or it could just be a grey could be your Chihuahua dog, you know, like it's colours, like, yeah, it will change.
At first I was trying to interpret the graphite with the colour, and I thought maybe you're trying that.
Not necessarily with that, but yeah. But then, you know, like there's a forest green over there, which of course creates a reference to like vegetation. So, you know, and yeah, and like the deep, like crimson reds tend to have a relation to the body, blood, things like that. But they're not specific. They're not, you know, it's meant to be like, you know, open. Yeah, yeah.
I really like the way you spoke about it being influenced by your bed. And
Yeah.
associations with sleep and.
But that's a great thing about being an artist, I think, because, you know, like it's almost like I use the metaphor of a funnel. You know, what we do, we have these. You can be reading this, but listening to that, or you could just see something like a splash of something on the floor, or, you know, things come from everywhere, but you try and crystallize it through a funnel, so it creates a coherent form. And yeah, sometimes I think that's just observing the world is important, you know, just looking. Yeah. And a lot of my inspiration, it doesn't come from books or, you know, like philosophy or theory, it's just from being fascinated with things, you know. Yeah.
That's great. Well, congratulations on the show.
Thank you, Alain. Yep.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks for the chat. And thanks for coming.
Thanks.